Let's talk about The Wheel of Time. Ever since I started posting about fantasy books on TikTok, one of the top comments I've gotten on almost every single video I've ever posted is to talk about The Wheel of Time. And the reason I've been putting this video off for so long is just because I have a lot to say about this series. It was the first truly epic fantasy series I ever read. It's obviously massive in size and scope, so there's just a lot to talk about. And I know this is a lot of people's favorite fantasy series, so I wanted to do the video I made about it justice. But now the time has come, I'm ready to talk about it. And to start off, I'll just clarify that I'm only going to be focusing on the books right now, not the Amazon Prime TV show. I might do a video on the TV show another time. And the way I'm going to do it is that the first half of the video will be a spoiler-free discussion of what The Wheel of Time is generally about and whether you should give it a try. And the second half of the video will be my spoiler-filled discussion of the books. Don't worry, I'll give fair warning before I jump into that. And over there, I'm going to focus on what I thought about the main characters and their arcs and what I thought about the ending in particular. It's really hard to talk about everything that happens in every single one of these books, so there's probably going to be key events that I don't mention. If you want me to talk more specifically about any of the key events that happen in a lot of the middle books especially, just let me know and I'll probably make shorter TikToks about specific books or specific events throughout The Wheel of Time. I started reading The Wheel of Time back when I was a sophomore in high school, and I think I finished it about when I was a junior, so about the span of 1 year. So obviously it's been some time since I read these books. I did reread some of the earlier books recently, but I just wanted to give that disclaimer that it's been a long time since I read these books. My memory is not perfect, but I tried to brush up on the main events and sequences in this book before making this video. And obviously I remember it a lot because I really love these books and I've talked about them a lot since I finished them with friends and online. So jumping into the spoiler-free discussion of these books and whether you should read them. I'll start off with just some basic background on these books. They were originally written by Robert Jordan, which was his pen name. I don't really remember his real name. But unfortunately, he passed away before he could finish the books, and that's when his widow reached out to Brandon Sanderson to finish the books. While that might be alarming to some people reading a completed series and only looking to read a completed series, I do want to say that Brandon Sanderson's last 3 books are generally pretty well received. He obviously struggled a little bit with some characters in particular, but by and large, I think the fandom agrees that he did a pretty good job finishing the books. And as I'll get into in the spoiler-filled discussion, I was pretty satisfied with the ending. Now, the basic overarching theme in The Wheel of Time is that there are no beginnings or endings to The Wheel of Time. That's how every single book starts and ends. So the basic concept is that the Wheel of Time keeps turning and the same events keep happening again and again in different iterations with the same characters representing in different ways. And this book series specifically spans one specific turning of the wheel. This allowed Robert Jordan to do some really interesting things in terms of fate versus free will and in terms of past lives interacting with the current life. While there are multiple magic systems in the book, there's one in particular that is the main primary magic system, and that's the powers of Saidin and Saidar, which are essentially pools of magical powers accessible to certain men and women. And which one of the two you're able to access, Saidin or Saidar, depends on whether you're a man or a woman. With this magic, users of the magic system are able to craft weaves. And there's 5 overarching types of weaves. There's air, earth, fire, water, and spirit. No, I'm not a Wheel of Time mega fan. I did look down on my phone to confirm I got those 5 right. I'm sorry. And as I mentioned, there's also secondary magic systems that exist throughout these books. There is a dream world that some people are able to access and control in these books. There's prophecies and one character in particular who can tell the future or sees visions of the future. There's one primary character who develops a kinship with wolves and more. That's the basic backdrop of the world. I'm not going to say too much more for the sake of brevity and because I don't want to get into spoilers. But now we'll get into where the first book actually starts. So no spoilers. This is just the basic backdrop of the plot now. And the basic backdrop for this series of books is that the last battle of this turning of the wheel is about to occur. And the last battle will basically take place between the Dark One, Shaitan, and the Dragon Reborn, who in the books is a male channeler of immense power. Channeler being someone who can use the magic system in the book. The Dark One, Shaitan, is not the only antagonist in the series. There are other antagonists that pop up throughout the course of the books, but again, that's getting a bit into spoilers, so I'm not going to talk about it much. And one of the basic plot lines of these books, and one of the central themes of these books, is that the Dragon Reborn is actually just this random boy on a farm you meet in the opening of the first book. And he has to come to terms with the fact that he's the destined savior of the world. With that basic backdrop, I'm now going to give my spoiler-free thoughts on The Wheel of Time and what I thought about it, which might be helpful information for you to decide whether or not you want to get into this behemoth of a series. I'll start off by saying that despite the length of this series, the first 3 to 4 books in particular have very good pacing. It might be slow for some folks, but personally, I enjoy the slower pace because it gives us time to get to know the characters before we really dive deep into the complexities of the world and the overarching plot. And I do believe the first 4 books are pretty well received even in terms of pacing. The first 3 to 4 books are also pretty much quest fantasy, and what I mean by that term is that they're the kind of fantasy books that involve a quest, where there's a group of people from this random village that have to go and accomplish this big task. Or in the second book, that same group of villagers has to go and track down this magical artifact that can save the world. If that's your vibe, the first 3 to 4 books are pretty enjoyable. After the first 3 to 4 books, especially once you get around to the 7th or the 8th book, you come across what's known as the slog. And it's called the slog because a lot of people really don't like the pacing of those books. However, personally, even during that quote-unquote slog, I still enjoyed those books. And while I can understand why it might be a major turnoff for some people, especially because Robert Jordan had a big habit of repeating himself again and again and getting bogged down in certain plot lines, there were still major events happening that were impacting the overarching plot of this entire series. And also, while Robert Jordan had a tendency to be repetitive, I personally found that repetitiveness helpful helpful, because sometimes there'd be a span of several weeks to months in between when I was reading these books. And personally, the repetitiveness critique has never made much sense to me, because you can always just skim those parts of the book. If you really remember everything is re-explaining, just skip past it. After the first 3 to 4 books, you also get into a lot more political fantasy, where the focus shifts from action and quest fantasy to a lot more of the politics of this world. I forget exactly how many, but I think there's about a dozen nations in this world, and almost every single one of them gets pretty thoroughly explored. Robert Jordan loved crafting entire cultures for each of the nations in his books, down to I think things like the kind of buttons they use on their clothes. If that's something you find interesting like I do, you'll probably enjoy even some of the slowest paced books in this series. A lot of these books also feature some really cool action scenes if that's what you're into. These are by no means action-packed books, and I wouldn't recommend them to someone who really likes John Gwynne and his action sequences, but they do have some really pivotal action sequences that are really enjoyable to read. And a big part of that, I think, is due to the fact that Robert Jordan himself was a soldier. Robert Jordan also has some really solid character work. Anytime you spend this much time with any given characters, you're bound to dive really deep into their psyches, their motivations, their desires, and their relationships. So you get a lot of really cool character work throughout this series, especially for the main protagonist, Rand. At the same time, though, I don't think Robert Jordan compares to someone like Robin Hobb in terms of his character work. Some of the characters, especially some side characters, end up being a little one-dimensional. And I'll throw in here that while Robert Jordan did some problematic things with the way he wrote his female characters, overall I think he did a pretty good job, especially for the time period when these books were being written, and his books do pass the Bechdel test with flying colors. Now I'll just give some spoiler-free thoughts on the ending of the series, because I know a lot of people are concerned about starting completed fantasy series if they don't have satisfying endings. I know I personally care about that. And for the people concerned that a different author finished these series, I'll just say that Robert Jordan had already drafted the last 3 to 4 pages of the entire series before he passed away. And again, Brandon Sanderson was a different author. He did some things well, he did some things not so well, and no one could have finished the books as well as Robert Jordan himself could have. But again, the fandom generally agrees that Brandon Sanderson did a pretty good job finishing these books. I personally found the ending very satisfying. There were obviously some flaws that even Brandon Sanderson himself recognizes, but by and large it was satisfying, and I don't think the fact that a different author finished this series should be of a concern to you. But yeah, those are my spoiler-free thoughts of The Wheel of Time, and that's all I'll say about it. Overall, this series is a solid 9 out of 10 for me. Some individual books are higher, some individual books are lower, but overall I'd give it a 9 out of 10. And for something of this scope, I think that's very impressive. The only other book series that compare to this in my mind, and from what I've read so far, are Malazan Book of the Fallen and The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. Stormlight Archive is close, but I'm not going to compare it to these completed fantasy series until it itself is completed. And I'm talking about the full 10-book span, not the 5-book span that's about to be completed this year. But yeah, if epic fantasy is what you're truly interested in, like I was at this time when I read these books, it's really hard to recommend anything other than The Wheel of Time. And of course, Realm of the Elderlings and Malazan Book of the Fallen, which I'll probably make similar videos for at some point in the future. Now I'm going to turn to my spoiler-filled thoughts on these books. So if you haven't read them and you don't want them to be spoiled, click away and come back after you've read this behemoth of a series. Even in the spoiler-filled section, I'm not going to go book by book just because that would take way too long. I might make shorter videos for each book at some point in the future. What I'll do instead is just talk generally about the first few books, the middle few books, and the last few books. So starting off with the first few books about the Eye of the World through the Shadow Rising and around maybe the 5th book as well, what I'll say is that I really enjoyed them. At this point in my life especially, I was really interested in just the general world building that takes place in fantasy books, and even details like the kinds of clothing people were wearing, what kind of political system a given country had in place, what the magic system was like, what kind of mythical creatures exist in this world, what kind of geography exists in this world was all very fascinating to me, and I think it was all very wonderfully done by Robert Jordan. The entire concept of the Wheel of Time itself was also very interesting to me. The way that Rand begins to realize that he's the dragon and he can hear the thoughts of his former lives. The way there is an entire age of legends in the past and the future, and the myths that came from that age of legends. All of that was very fascinating to me. I also especially loved how Robert Jordan had a lot of ambiguity with the prophecies at play in these books. Because again, if you do have a universe like this where there is a Wheel of Time that keeps turning again and again, legends will come to pass and turn to myths. And there will be a lot of confusion about what exactly they mean or what they were referencing. And I think Robert Jordan really played with all of that really beautifully, even early in the books. There are some particular plot points in The Eye of the World and The Great Hunt in particular that I was just left confused by. But again, I'm not going to get into too many minor details about every single book and nitpick them. What I will say is that the early books are some of my favorites in the entire series. Really getting to see how the Emmonsfield Five and also Elaine go from the characters that they were to who they're starting to become was very interesting to me. I know Egwene gets a lot of hate, but I personally really enjoyed her entire arc over the series. I know she becomes a little insufferable towards the end, but personally I feel like it's a realistic development for that character. I also loved the contrast Robert Jordan presented between Egwene and Nynaeve and how they viewed their lives in Emmonsfield. And Mat, of course, was one of my favorite characters. His wit, his humor, his hate for the Aes Sedai, I just loved all of it. I did find Rand's character a little bland at the beginning of this series, but I think as he starts growing into the Dragon Reborn, starts struggling with what it means to be the Dragon Reborn, eventually becomes Dark Rand and then Jesus Rand, I ended up really enjoying all that character development. I think Robert Jordan did it splendidly. It was just in the first couple of books where I thought he was a little bland. For Perrin, I was absolutely enthralled by his arc with the wolves and Hop and all that good stuff, but I will say that the bulk of his story, especially in the middle few books, got really annoying to read, and I used to dread coming across his chapters, especially when he was just trying to save Filey. I don't know if that's how you say her name. I never listened to the audiobooks, so excuse me if I'm pronouncing some of these names incorrectly. I do love that Perrin ended up being the one person from the Emond's Field 5 that went back home and actually took care of the place they came from. I thought it was very cool that Robert Jordan had at least one of the main 5 do that, and I think it made sense that it was Perrin. That commitment and that loyalty he felt to where he came from really resonated with me, and I thought it was very well executed. Like I said earlier with Egwene, I really loved her arc overall. I think the person she became was very believable. I liked how she was contrasted with Nynaeve. The only issue I had with her was that her rise to Mirelin didn't really seem believable to me. And I know some people laugh at the concept of believability in fantasy books. Like, if you can envision a world with the one power, how can you not believe in a world where Egwene would become a Mirelin? But I think what I mean by a believable is whether that thing would be likely to happen within the rules of the universe Robert Jordan himself created. And given the amount of power the White Tower has, given the prestige of the position of a Mirelin, I didn't really find it believable that any of the sisters would have agreed to make Egwene a Mirelin. And I know the situation at that time was unique and there was a whole White Tower split and everything happening, but it still just didn't sit right with me and didn't make any sense. It definitely made for interesting reading, but it did take me out of the book a little bit. Nynaeve was one of my favorite characters of all time. I love how she went from village wisdom to a healer to one of the strongest Aes Sedai and healers in the world. I love that she's the one who figured out how to cure madness and male channelers, and I just think her overall story is fascinating. I did find the romance between her and Lan a little odd and forced at times, but as it developed, it started sitting better with me and I started enjoying it more. I really didn't like Elaine's character, and this is another one of those chapters I would dread coming across. That might just be because of my general tendency to hate people of royalty, and I will recognize that disliking the personality of a character isn't necessarily a reason to think it was poorly written. But yeah, I just dreaded the Elaine chapters. I can't really get more specific. I don't remember all the specific details. I just really remember dreading coming across her chapters. Moiraine, I think, is one of the best written characters in all of fantasy. Her entire personality, her entire aura, I think, is expertly and perfectly done. The way she balances actually caring for the Emond's Field 5, but then also recognizing that she's willing to make any sacrifice possible to save the world. It was just so perfectly crafted. I honestly just wish we'd gotten to see more of her. Given how central a character she is, she really doesn't get much screen time in the book, and that has been one of my biggest gripes with the series. I'll also just mention Min. I think the way Min's prophecies worked was fascinating. It was incredible that Robert Jordan planted seeds about how the entire series would end through prophecies that Min was seeing in the first book. And I know Robert Jordan explored the psychological impact these visions would have on Min a little bit, but I don't think it was done perfectly, and I wish he'd explored it a little more than he actually did. I'll end this spiel about the characters in the series by talking about Aviendha and how she was one of the coolest characters in the entire series. I don't really have any gripes with how that character was handled, but what I will say is that the whole love square, I guess I'll call it, of Rand, Elaine, Min, and Aviendha was always so odd and bizarre to me. Elaine, Min, and Aviendha are presented as these really strong, independent female characters, and Elaine is actually royalty, so I really struggle to reconcile all their independent, strong personalities with the fact that they would ever agree to share a man. It just never made sense to me, and I was always really puzzled by Robert Jordan's decision to do that. I vaguely remember this one scene where they've all bonded Rand, and I forget what the combination of people were, but two of the girls were walking away while Rand and the third girl started getting it on, and the two girls walking away were trying to avoid what they were feeling through their bond. And that scene in particular has just stuck with me through the years because I think it highlights how absurd this idea was that these three women would agree to share Rand. But anyway, that's enough about that. It always just struck me as odd. It took me out of the story a little bit. I didn't think it jived with their characters, but I'm not going to say any more about that. Now I just want to talk a little bit about some of the side characters. I'm not going to go too in depth again because of brevity. I absolutely hated Galad and Gawain. Again, not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I never listened to audiobooks. I just found their characters to be, again, very annoying. Again, I recognize that's not necessarily a critique of the books or how the characters were crafted. I just hated those guys in general. Hop and Bella were some of my favorite characters in the series, even though I know they didn't get too much screen time. I actually named the first car I ever bought after Bella. Moving on to the Forsaken, I really enjoyed the vast majority of them. And I say that very specifically because while there were 13 Forsaken, and you would think that in a series of this size, you would be able to accommodate all of them, I actually don't think a lot of the Forsaken got as much screen time as they should have, and I was interested to see a lot more of them, especially ones like Grandal and Moridien. Again, excuse the pronunciations. And we just didn't get to see as much of them as I would have liked. And then add on to that the fact that Robert Jordan started bringing some of them back to life with different names, and it just got so confusing. I don't know if I was just too young to be following these books, but adding on Resurrection with different names on top of the already massive cast of characters in the 13 original Forsaken just became too confusing and unnecessary for me, especially when the Forsaken already weren't getting enough screen time. With all that being said, I did love the Forsaken, especially Lanfear, and I'll talk about the show some other time, but I also love how they did Lanfear in the show. And I also really enjoyed Demandred, especially how Brandon Sanderson did him in the last book. But again, I just wish we got to see more of them. Again, I could say a lot about the middle of these books especially, but I'm just going to jump now towards the ending and talk about what I thought about the ending, because I feel like that's what's most interesting. I'll start off with the battle between Rand and Shaitan. I love how Brandon Sanderson handled it. I don't think it could have been done better, frankly. I'm very curious to see how Robert Jordan himself would have done it, but we'll never know. But it is hard for me to imagine how it could have been even better. The way they were creating alternative versions of reality, and that's what their final battle was like, I think was perfect and fit perfectly with the themes of the books. And again, I'll talk about the show some other time, but I did like how they incorporated that version of the last battle in the end of season 1 of the show. I love how Matt handled Rand in the last battle, how his memories came back and were able to assist him in being the main general for the Forces of Light. Demandre appearing out of nowhere with the Sharran forces was something I never expected, never saw coming, and was absolutely floored by. And then of course that iconic scene of Lan finally sheathing the sword to defeat Demandre is just one of the best moments I've ever read in fiction. Still gives me shivers to just think about it, and it's been like 10 years since I read it. Egwene's sacrifice and how she discovered it through a conversation with Perrin in the Dream World, where Perrin pointed out that Balefire is just a weave. I thought all of that was absolutely wonderful, very satisfying to read. But yeah, overall, just generally really enjoyed the last book. Thought it was wrapped up pretty well overall, especially the last battle with how much hype it had around it and how much had been promised over the course of these 14 books with regards to the last battle. I thought Brandon Sanderson did a fantastic job, and it did live up to the hype. I honestly struggled to say too many negative things about the last book or the last battle, but I will say one or two things. I mean, Brandon Sanderson himself acknowledged this. Some threads were just left unresolved. Haddan Fain famously was dealt with very poorly. His whole ending was very anticlimactic and unsatisfying. And of course, there's the obvious big massive plot point of the Seanchan and how they treat women who can channel. That was left completely open, but I believe it was because Robert Jordan planned to write some books focused on Mat and Tuan. Again, excuse the pronunciations if they're wrong, I really just don't know. But of course, he never got the chance to do that, which is very unfortunate and does leave one of these major plot lines unresolved, or at least semi-unresolved. I could keep ranting about iconic scenes from the last book, like the will he ride alone scene with Lan and Nynaeve, but instead I also want to focus on Rand and his ending, obviously, as he was the main protagonist. And I do think his ending was done well. He finally fought the last battle, he sacrificed a lot, and now he gets his happy ending where he gets to walk off into the sunset. I like to imagine that he eventually met up with his friends and family. Obviously, we don't get that on screen. I really wanted to see the Emond's Field boys at least get back together, if not the whole crew. Obviously, Egwene had died by then. I really wish we had gotten to see that on screen. And I do really like how he ended up wrapping up the Aiel story. I thought the role they were given at the end of the last book was a solid one, and it was the best they really could have hoped for. Obviously, again, there's a lot more I could say. Let me know if you guys want me to make a video just about the ending and how the major plot lines were resolved, because I just have so much to say. And again, with this kind of content, it's hard to figure out what to put in one video versus another. But with this being my overarching thoughts on the Wheel of Time, I'm going to stop there. Obviously, the Wheel of Time is one of the most classic fantasy series to exist. It's one of the longest fantasy series to exist. It's absolutely legendary both in scope and quality. It's hard to recommend it too highly, and I feel like despite all its flaws, if you're a hardcore fantasy fan like me, it is a must-read. Yeah, that's where I'll end, and let me know if you guys want me to make any more content on TikTok or YouTube specific to the Wheel of Time. Hopefully on more specific books or plot lines or issues or themes or foreshadowing or theories, because again, there's just too much to say to fit in one video. I've done my best here. But yeah, let me know what y'all want to see. And as always, subscribe and go follow on TikTok, or else.